Hello, welcome to Dive In 2023. My name is Jhan Doughty. I am the Global Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Everest. And we are so proud and excited to have you join us today. On behalf of the sponsors for today's session, Access Capital, Everest, and Travelers, we are excited to introduce you and bring you into our session. Just a couple of things today. This session is being sponsored, as I said, by the companies that I mentioned, but also it is part of the Gender Parity Workstream, an amazing group of insurance executives from around the globe who all contributed to today's session and our presenters today. Before we begin, there are a few key details that I'd like to share with you. So since this is a live Teams call today and all of you on CVent, we will towards the end ask some questions, but of course, make sure you're muted throughout today's session. As you hear the conversation today, which we know will be very engaging, please make sure that as we're talking, you're jotting down questions for us that you may have, because we will have time for you at the end. Lastly, there is a chat feature in CVent. So if you do have a question or thing that you would like to say, please put it in the CVent chat. And now with all of those details out of the way, because I know our panelists and we're going to have a great conversation today, please join me in welcoming our moderator, Rod Colon, who is the president and CEO of Rod Colon Consulting and a global DEI consultant, who will introduce our distinguished panel and get our conversation going. Rod, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Jhan. It was awesome. And welcome to our global dive-in community. I'll be your moderator, as many say, Rod Colon or Rodrigo Alejandro Colon, all the way from Englishtown, New Jersey. I've been involved with DEI for at least 2 decades. And as an executive coach, that whole thing of really owning your career and really owning diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging have been, wow, cornerstone in my life. But I want to turn it now over to our panelists. Awesome team to introduce themselves. Let's start with Wes.
All right. Hey, Rod. Hey, everyone out there. Dive in. I'm Wes Alexander. I'm the Vice President of Workforce Solutions for Travelers Insurance Company. I am really honored to be here. I'm happy to be part of the Gender Parity work stream, and I'm happy to be here, honestly, with Jhan and Rod and Dan and Ari, kind of talking about this sort of allyship and the type of ways in which we try to both from a corporate standpoint, but then also just as humans, really wanting to be someone who can stand up and support and advocate for others. So Workforce Solutions, my group was created a couple of years ago. I've been with Travelers for 9 years. The best way to describe it, it's really a safe space for employees to speak honestly and freely through the Travelers organization. We're really proud of allowing folks to, have a place where they know they can be seen and heard. As we get into this, I can talk a little bit more about what that work is and what we do. But at this point, I'm just excited and ready to go. So thanks, Rod.
Awesome. Ari?
Hey, Rod, thanks for having me. And Wes, fully agree with you. Very happy to be here. Great to be with the panelists. I'm lucky enough to work at Everest with Jhan, so I do see her quite often. We have a lot of conversations and a lot going on. I'm currently the Group Chief Risk Officer at Everest. I've had various roles between operations, actuarial. I did grow up on the actuarial side, but I was first joined Everest in 2010. I recall seeing the Women's Networking Group at Everest, first startup many, many years back, and also seeing the evolution within Everest, both as what we're doing in the market, and what we're doing as a company, but also what we're doing with all our people and internally, the advent of all our business and employee resource groups that have come up. I've been a member as well of our inaugural DEI councils a few years back, as well as the executive sponsor for a few of our different employee resource groups. I also, being on the gender parity track, happy to report, I'm also very involved with an organization called NAWA, the Network of Actuarial Women and Allies. I'm on the board there. I started there as a volunteer first. And a lot of what we do is really working towards women's support, creating a network, as well as advocacy and including allyship across the actuarial profession. So very happy to be here, and I'll turn it over to Dan.
Sure. Thanks, Ari. So I'm Dan Osterrieder, head of North America Casualty at Axis Re, which is an underwriting team. Been here 4.5 years, and I'm also part of our DEI Global Council, and I've been part of that group since the formation here at Axis Capital. So as the team said, I think very excited about the discussion that we're about to have. I know there's a lot of topics, hopefully engaging. And Rod, with that, I'll hand it over to you to get going.
All right. Thank you, Dan. And thank you, our panelists. Awesome job. I'm hoping for all of you in the audience that this will feel like it's just a chat between four of us. And I thought we can open up today's discussion by asking a few questions. Here's our first one, and this is open to Dan, Ari, and Wes. You just kind of chime in and who would like to take it. But here's the first question. I want to begin by asking the three of you, when I say the term allyship, what does that mean to you both intellectually and behaviorally?
So I can tee things up, I guess, just simply, right? I think for me, allyship is really how do you amplify the voices of marginalized or underrepresented groups? And I think we'll dig into exactly what that means. But the behavior part of the question, I think, is really important because it's someone who listens, someone who supports, but also someone who actually takes action, which I think we'll dig into what kind of action that means. But simply, I think those, for me, are the key elements of allyship.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say piggybacking on that as well. And I appreciate, just as a starting point, that we're splitting up what it means intellectually versus behaviorally. When I think on my own personal journey, you know what, I had to get over that or had to work through an intellectual journey first. And thereafter it was, okay, what does this mean in action? And then the courage needed sometimes to act up or talk up as well. But for me, intellectually, I view allyship, it's really about being cognizant and keeping a lookout for where the inequities lie. And it's almost, the old parable of the fish swimming in the water, and then they see one of the elder fish there, and the elder fish said, hey kids, how's the water today? And the younger fish say, what's water? It's sometimes hard to see when you're in the thick of it. And you know what? I think being cognizant and on the lookout of what's happening, whether it's intentional, unintentional, conscious, subconscious, that in and of itself, that's the first step. And then behaviorally is, okay, now that we're cognizant and now that we are on the lookout and we see where things are occurring, are we courageous enough to speak up and maybe disrupt the status quo? Sometimes that means debating a topic. Sometimes that means just having a discussion. And sometimes it just means creating a space to be thoughtful and aware of what's going on. And that in and of itself helps raise awareness with others too.
Yeah. And if I'll just add, I do love the distinction between the two. Because yes, you have to get there intellectually, but I think to really the point both Ari and Dan were making, at some point, how can you have enough awareness to then have the courage to take action, right? So that behavioral piece of it, I hope that's really a part we'll get into today. But I think that, it's one thing to know, it's a second thing to act, and wanting to get support and act in a way that's meaningful. I think that's when you're really accessing allyship.
Yeah, no, great on that. And just continuing on that, would you say that there are certain behaviors, as you were chatting, behaviors that you practice consistently to demonstrate allyship? So what are some of those practices you consistently do to share that?
I'll start. I think the one thing that I know I can be consistent is, as an ally, is really understanding and owning my privilege. And if we're using it in the context of kind of male and female relationships, my privilege as a man, right? Like consistently being aware of the fact that, me being born in this country as a, assigned gender as a male to begin with, and keeping that assigned gender, right? And that generally works in my favor more often than it does to work against me. And just, not feeling guilty about it, not, feeling bad about it, but fully just embracing and understanding and calling it what it is. You know, as a man, there are certain things within the American diaspora that are allowed for me, that have been acceptable for me, that have just on balance tends to work in my favor. So I think for me, I want to consistently be grounded in that and understand that. And you know, again, not use it as an excuse on either side, but you know, have that historical context to know that, you know, my gender does work for me, and maybe it doesn't always work for others, e.g., those who are female gender. It may not always benefit you the way that it benefits me.
Yeah. Dan?
If I had to pick one or two, I'd think listening and learning, which don't always feel like the most proactive, but I think if you're doing them correctly and taking them seriously, I think that's one of the most critical things you can do as an ally, because by nature, you're working with a group that you don't necessarily belong to on a surface level, right? So you have to learn, what is it that they care about? What are the passions? What are the pain points? And how can you help? So I think that is where I would focus. And I also think the word consistency that you used in the question is key. Sometimes it's not big actions. It's not always speaking in front of a crowd. I think it's often that consistent day-to-day small things that you're doing with the colleagues and business partners that can actually make the most difference.
Yeah, thank you, Dan.
Yeah, Dan, I'd wholeheartly agree. I mean, that last comment you made, those small actions that you do on a consistent, it sets a baseline, so people have awareness and they understand what you do and they learn from that. I found that to be more powerful than conversations or debates. And for me, what I've always found in one of those consistent actions I've taken, and I mentioned the idea of being courageous before, of either speaking up and whatnot. And I love that we're all focusing on different behaviors, because there are different things that you could do to all be aligned in the same goal here. For me, it's about creating spaces and amplifying voices. So, you know, just as an example, and meetings always have a certain flow to them. And frankly, a lot of people are stuck in that cadence, not always seeing the forest for the trees, similar to the fish parable and just saying what's water. You know, but when you stop that flow and you disrupt, not in an excess manner, but you stop the flow and say, you know what, I'd like to hear what she says, and point out the voice that wasn't being heard, or I haven't heard the opportunity to hear from so-and-so, and you point to the woman who wasn't heard. It highlights to others there's this moment where they snap back and it's like, oh, there was a vacuum there, or airtime wasn't being shared well. And it creates a little bit of awareness because of your consistent action of making the time and space for others.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much for that, panelists. And look, here's one that this is one that at times we come across. Some individuals will say that this does not matter, that the need to speak up and support issues related to gender and allyship aren't needed. How do you respond to this level of thinking? Harry, I see you shaking your head there.
Yeah, look, I'd love to say it's never happened. It happens. It certainly happens. You work, you know, I working with NAWA. You're in the spotlight sometimes, and you have people coming up at actual conferences and starting the conversation and saying, come on, what's the point? Or, you know, you see that sometimes. I think there's twofold here. We have to recognize that this is like a center of gravity shift is kind of the way I like to think about it. And we have to redefine success a little bit. It doesn't mean every person everywhere overnight is all of a sudden on board. It's any large body of people. You're going to have pushers, you're going to have pullers. And what you're really trying to do is shift that center of gravity. So what you end up having for every individual, you have a part to play, whether it's intellectual, behavioral. Obviously, behavioral, I think, has a stronger impact, but wherever you have your impact, that small impact, it accumulates. And whether that means standing up as, again, ally, just an understander, or even someone who felt against, but now they're at least neutral. They say, well, I don't appreciate it, but at least I understand where you're coming from. You have to call that some level of success as well. And in conjunction with that, you have to recognize also one very important skill when you're talking with people in anything related to gender parity or diversity, equity, inclusion altogether is you have to know your audience. You need to be able to speak in the language of how they're thinking in order for them to understand and relate to it. You want to talk to someone in the C-suite, you better be talking about bottom line impact and all the studies that have been shown time and time again about how diversity and equity have proven the bottom line for companies. You want to point, when you talk to the CHRO and human resource individuals, you want to know about the impact of culture. You talk to distribution people, you want to talk about how we need to look like the rest of the world and who we support if we want to understand their needs. Everyone has a different flavor to it, and you really got to know that audience. I think it's just a really important tactic in order to have any to be effective.
Yeah, thanks, Ari. Hey, Wes,
Yeah,
have
I
you
would
ever
add.
faced them? Yeah, go ahead.
So I was
Dan,
just getting
sorry.
triggered. I think for someone that says that the topic doesn't matter, right? I think it's look around our industry, right? And even if you put gender aside, look at the talent gap that we have looming over us as an industry. And if we think we're going to get there by not being inclusive, I think we're just doomed, to fail, frankly. So I think the more people we can pull in, elevate into the discussion, I think it's needed as an industry. I think your points on knowing your audience are spot on. Like you said, the bottom line focus, and the more you can personalize it to the individual that might be challenging, I think you're going to have more success. Absolutely.
Yeah. And Rod, I think the only thing I would add is kind of right along the lines of what Dan was saying, is that if you're saying it doesn't matter, it's just I don't think you're taking a long-term approach to what's most successful for your business down the line. I think it's short-sighted. And I think that if people continue to take the approach that, let's do things the way that we've always done them because it's worked. I think that those are the companies, I think those are the places, I think those are the organizations that get left behind, right? So if we're not thinking about what is best from a long-term standpoint, including being more inclusive, allowing more people to the table, allowing more voices to come to the table, and being more open and understanding that by doing that, it's not a zero-sum game, it just makes us better. I think if you're not approaching it in that way, you're going to get left behind.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Here's one open to the three of you. Why should men engage in advocacy? And what would be like the first thing they should do? Why should men engage in advocacy? And what would be something they could immediately do? Wes?
I think men should engage in advocacy because I look at the power structure of society, right? I mean, at the end of the day, right? I mean, I'm not saying anything that folks can't identify just by looking at your own organization, looking at government, looking at leadership in general, however you perceive that, or even when you say who's a leader, what pops in your head, right? I think that, we have to get men involved to understand that this one way of thinking, kind of to what I was saying before, is not the way to move forward. I think, to have men involved and to be serious about gender parity and allyship and advocacy, through a place of power, really provides an open door and an opportunity for those to then be able to walk through them. So at the end of the day, not only listen, I think everybody should be on board here, right? Men, women, but if you just take it from a power structure standpoint, the way in which society has been set up to this point, you have to get the people who have been the benefit of the system involved to change the system.
And Ari, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think they're good points. Slightly different angle, but very similar ideas. That I think there's, and I've seen this in conversations over the years. There's always a natural assumption that when women are advocating for gender parity, well, that's self-preservation, right? When you have men step in as allies, as advocates, I mean, that part of the conversation isn't there. There's no, hey, what's your ulterior motive? It takes away the potential of people viewing this as an us versus them. And at the end of the day, there's a natural human behavior. When you hear something from somebody, very often you judge who is saying those words, not necessarily those words by themselves. And I think when you have a man act as an ally talking about gender parity and talking about equitability for women, they're not looking at the man as a man. If a woman says it, they might look at the woman as a woman and then judge the words. It takes the focus away from the who towards the what. And I do think it helps engage that conversation. Again, fully agree with Wes. You got to recognize the train stopped for us at one point. It's only fair we have it stop for others, and you got to make it. It's going to be the local train. It's for everybody. But sometimes it's also about just that basic human behavior. It takes some of the preconceived notions or some of the look. I'll tell you real quick. And apologize, Dan. I'll toss it to you in 1 second. I've had people over the years who have mentioned to me, it's like, well, you do this because you have daughters. I'm like, well, look, I know I'm not a life or health actuary, so I don't know birth rates offhand, but I'm pretty sure a lot of people with kids have daughters. So like that's not a fair argument. And last checked, anyone else who had a kid, it was pretty much 50-50 that they might have had a daughter. So like, where are you coming from with that argument? So it's just, again, people kind of jump towards, not every, again, some people, they jump towards these preconceived notions. And in many ways, it takes that off the table. We're just talking about the topic as equal, mano a mano, if you want to look at it that way. And when you take that out, you get right to the meat of the conversation.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think why should men engage? Because we can make a big difference, as I think Wes and Ari outlined. And Ari, I think there is a personal connection as well at times. I think it's balancing the business connection as well as personal. And for me as well, father of daughters, I remember hearing a talk once where someone said, men should be outraged that society values daughters less than sons. And having a son as well, I think that you see both sides of that. And I think from a personal perspective, as well as a business perspective, that's where a lot of the passion comes from the folks that I've seen get more heavily involved. But I completely agree with Ari's comment on, I think the most powerful examples of allyship are where somebody has no personal connection and there's nothing they can tie to. They're just there to stand up and support another group. And I think that comes across in a much different, more powerful way, where they're searching for that other motive and it's not there. I think that is extremely powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so key to have different ways of thinking, different cultures, different, the whole brain thinking. And from a process of business, it's critical. We don't all want to be the same. We want all the differences included. That makes us, as an individuals, as organizations, the best. This question is for Dan. Dan, are you ready? Here we go. In the roles that you have held, you are known for finding ways to support inclusion. In your experience, what situations have you found advocacy to be helpful, most effective?
Yes, I mean, I'm humbled by this question that was raised when I first saw it, because I think ultimately being an ally, being an advocate is not something you necessarily get to choose yourself, right? You can choose behaviors, you can try to be one, but ultimately that's defined by the group that you are supporting. And I think as well, what actions are most beneficial and impactful also is the group that you're supporting and trying to raise up, not necessarily you as the ally. So I think this is one that's a little tough to answer, but if I think through some of those more tangible examples, I think engaging other men is something that can be very impactful and noticed around an organization, because I think to some of Wes's and Ari's earlier points, sometimes it's tougher for women to speak up and raise these issues. It's different for a man to raise it to other men in an organization and say, we need to do more and challenge each other. I think there's examples of encouraging women to apply for roles, right? Many of us have seen this, where a man may have 30% of the qualifications and is going full speed, throwing their name into the ring, and a woman may have 90% and feel like, I'm missing the 10, should I go for it? I think I've seen a few examples in my career of colleagues supporting each other and saying, go for it. You might not be all the way there, you'll grow into it, which has been very impactful. And then I touched on it earlier, but I think just showing up to listen and learn means more than people realize. And I've seen that firsthand, where I'm not necessarily driving action. I'm just there to learn and better understand, and the meaningfulness to the other groups. I think it goes a long way, because they don't see people as involved that aren't within their specific groups.
Yeah. I mean, how many times do I think, does it come to my mind that putting myself in a woman's shoes, right? From just thinking about it from that standpoint. Thank you, Dan, for that. Wes, we come to you next. You have a long-standing career of engaging in work centered on advocacy, belonging, and creating inclusive spaces in the insurance industry. What are some practical tactics and tools that you have found successful when engaging in acts of advocacy?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that, Rod. A few things, the first thing that popped in my head, it's kind of similar to what Dan was saying, but it's really listening for understanding, right? If you think about the role that, myself and my group plays, we're an open resource for employees to come and have conversations, about whatever they may be experiencing at Travelers. I think, one of our main tasks, and if we're going to eventually either advocate for somebody in this forum, or if I'm just doing it on a personal level or just as an executive of Travelers, my goal is to not assume what you want, but to really fully understand what does advocacy look like for you? What are we trying to achieve? So, I think the first practical kind of tactic for me is let's get on the same page in terms of me fully understanding what's the end game here, right? Are you in a situation where you just want to be heard more in your meetings? Are you in a situation where you're trying to figure out, why you haven't gotten the promotion? Are you in a situation where you're thinking about a complete career change, but then really kind of getting underneath that? What's driving this decision? And then how can we get to where you want to go? Because I now feel comfortable that I am aligned with you in terms of what the goals are. So just, kind of really taking the time to do less talking, more listening and listening in a really active way, so that I can try to determine, we can kind of try to determine what's the path here. And using that, I think, as a tool has been helpful. I think the other thing that I'd admit, or that I'd say is, I want to leverage, my entire network, right? So if we have identified, for example, I'm dealing with some individual and she's telling me kind of what it is that her next step, perfect job would be, or where she believes she can be an impact on a larger scale within our organization, is that how can I, use the relationships that I've built to draw people in and be a bridge, right? So being a connector as much as humanly possible, I really try to lean into that. It's something that I enjoy. I like to do it personally. Like, I'm the dude who likes to have the party at his house, right? So, any way I can leverage the connections and relationships that I have formed in order to get somebody else in a better position, or at least to think about, is this a better position for you, or does this lead you where you were thinking you want to go? I really want to lean into that.
Yeah, absolutely, Wes. Advocacy, connecting, sponsorship. Awesome. This one's for Ari. You're on the board of our network of actuarial women and allies to advance women in the insurance industry. Ari, what led you to take that step to enter this work on a national and global level in this way?
Well, okay, I'll rewind the tape a little bit. When I was overseeing the actuarial team for Everest's reinsurance division, we would have a annual get-together. We like to call them summits, but it's an internal conference for our actuaries globally. We bring them all in one room, sometimes virtual, though obviously COVID mucked the water a little bit on that one. But we would go through a lot of technical training, continuing ed for a lot of people. It was just a good opportunity to connect and really very business focused. And over the years, we wanted to mix it up and get a little more flavor. We would have people from different departments come in and try to give a little bit more. So at one point when I was in charge of putting together the agenda, I said, well, let's create a diversity space. Let's bring in someone from our HR team. Let's bring in someone from talent acquisition to help give people the skills to do equitable interviewing and help with pipeline development. And I wanted to bring in speakers from the industry. I worked with people in the past. I knew someone who was on IABA, the International Association of Black Actuaries, OLA, the Organization for Latino Actuaries. SAGA was a new organization at the time, the Sexuality and Gender Alliance. And then I went to look for the women's networking group of where that was, and there was none. And it completely shocked me. I was like, well, firstly, how did I not hear about it? And luckily, about 4 weeks later, there's a LinkedIn announcement. It was on the scene. I said, I need to know who they are. I'm bringing them into Everest. We got to do this right away. Managed to meet some of the most impressive and amazing women I've met in my career who put this together. And we got them in the door right away. And from there, it was like, look, you just started. Let's talk after the event. What could we do as a company? How can we engage more? We have a big actuarial team. We want to get involved. What's our way to get involved? And from there, it led to volunteering for helping them develop pipelines for partnership, meaning they had different pillars. We were focusing on partnership, and I worked on that committee with someone else. And at one point, they asked me to join the board, and humbly, I was honored that they asked, and very excited to join. It's like, look, if we could put a little rocket fuel on this fire and do some catch up, because it's been a lot of years where this wasn't around, let's go for it. And, it's been expanding. I would be a little careful on the global level comment that you mentioned. I wouldn't say that we're exactly fully global. Right now, we're very concentrated in US and North America, practically just because that's where a lot of us are physically located, and that's where a lot of our connections are. But we're getting there. We have good plans ultimately. But for me, it was a great opportunity to put, again, you talk about behaviors. This was just such an easy way to be able to take some skills that I've learned over the years from working in leadership positions and really help drive this organization forward.
Beautiful. Thank you, Arian. Thank you for that. We're going to be just for those in the audience, please start getting those questions in and putting them in the room, and we're going to be taking them shortly. Question for the panel, open. Can you share, and this is more of a story, can you share a personal experience of when your advocacy worked out, failed, or backfired? And how did you handle any pushback? Who would like to take that one first? Wes, you sound excited there. I see the face there, babe.
I can go because it really is related to kind of what I was saying before. I've had some great success stories, right? And again, part of that is through the role. Part of that is hopefully through being a connector and seeing, women kind of achieve or get things that, they've been able to get because they wanted it, and me being a help in that. But I think I'll focus on one that didn't work. And it was early in career, well before I was working at Travelers. But I remember there was a woman that I was working with that I really wanted to help, right? I could tell we were working in a law firm at the time. Many of us were struggling, but she was struggling particularly. And I was thinking, hey, I have a relationship with a law firm partner. If I could just get you in contact with David, you'll be fine. What I failed to do is actually ask her what it is that she wanted. Like what was really happening, right? I knew that there was just some struggles actually on the job, but I was driving her to get more work. and truthfully, at this particular time, she didn't need more work. She needed training, right? She needed help kind of getting through the day-to-day rigors of being in a large law firm. And I sent her right into a freaking, a lion's den of now I'm not trained and you're getting more work thrown at you. So, it leads back to really listening for understanding and making sure that I don't, assume that what I want is what you want, that I don't, mansplain the situation. Here's what you need to do. You just need to work harder. Right. But instead, like the first piece for me of being an advocate is figuring out what we're advocating for.
Absolutely. Guilty as charged. I mean, boy, trying to be a man from Mars. Yeah. How about you, Ari?
I would, I'd focus a little bit on the self-failure part. I've definitely try to advocate and have messed up in different areas where it did not work. It was not necessarily something they wanted. Similar, Wes, like you're describing. Some of it was trying to have conversations with people about other women in the company and equitability and, again, not talking in the language of how people were thinking. And that was a fail on my part. I think the important item that I would mention over here is, how do you handle that fail? It's you got to do it with grace. You're gonna break some eggs. That's just the nature. It might upset a person. It might just be you're not gonna do it right. I think from an advocacy standpoint, you have to take that risk. You got to be courageous and you got to be willing. Learn from others. right? So see where other people did the right thing, did the wrong thing, and try to learn from that. That's always a good starting point. Mentorship in order to how to be a better ally is hugely valuable. I think that's something that I didn't have right away, and something I picked up over time. But again, I would tell everybody everything's going to have some level of fail here or there. It is inevitable, and it's part of a process. So fail with grace, pick yourself right back up, and just keep going at it.
Absolutely. All part of authentic leadership. Dan, anything on that one?
Nothing too specific, but I think one of the themes, just listening and reflecting myself, is not jumping too quickly into action, which I think some of us are guilty, especially when you're earlier in an understanding of DEI, right? And there's excitement and you want to make a difference and tend to jump right into action, which I think is great. You don't want to be passive and waiting and your voice is never heard. But I think as Ari and Wes hit earlier, I mean, getting that understanding to make sure that what you're doing, how you're spending your energy is actually helpful, I think is something we can all learn from. And, you're not jumping in to save the situation, right? You can be supportive and helpful. You're not an ally is not the savior. People have their own voices and people want to raise their voices in different ways. And I think that's something I've reflected on myself. And I think as long as your heart's in the right place, your intentions are in the right place, you're graceful, I think people still appreciate it. And you learn and grow and move on from there.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dan. Members of the Dive in Gender Parity team shares a few questions. Here's one that I thought was quite interesting, open to the three of you. Companies are increasingly promoting internal DEI initiatives and employee-led business groups. The recent 2022 Women in the Workplace study revealed that women are 2 times as likely as male leaders to spend substantial time on DEI work, and 40% of women leaders say DEI work is not acknowledged in performance reviews and in many other areas. What are your thoughts on this and what could be done?
So, Rod, I don't mind starting off with that. I mean, just like any form of culture change or culture shift, there has to be some level of, I don't want to use the word accountability. It's a strong term, but there has to be a voice. It can't be done as a platitude. If a company is going to have diversity as a focus with these resource groups, they certainly should be including that diversity is a cultural behavior. I think a lot of companies have mission statements, and I think a lot of which is what should you expect the company stands for. They also have behaviors and cultural tenets of what do we expect individuals to be doing. A lot of companies, I know Everest has this, we have diversity is within that. It goes into performance reviews. You have to look at your cultural tenets and your behaviors and say, did I act? Was I fair? Was I equal? Did I advocate? And you have to think about that amongst all the various behaviors and tenets that we have. There has to be some type of line of sight or spotlight given that shows everybody the value and shows everybody the importance. When you have that strong message coming through, there's this, again, it's a little rocket fuel to a fire over there.
Beautiful. Wes?
Yeah, I love how Ari is talking about, this idea of like spotlighting it, right? Like really making it something that's a focus and tying it into your other cultural values, right? And I think that's what we've tried to do as well, right? Like, understand what our expectations are in the space, but then, allow for people to bring a highlight to it, bring a spotlight to it, and to the point that you were kind of making in the question, and be rewarded for that, right? And it's not always going to be a direct one-to-one relationship, but you can get people exposure. For example, I think about how we access our diversity networks, and that allows people to get exposure to leaders that they would never have access to if they weren't a member of the leadership teams within our diversity networks, right? So sometimes it's not as clear in terms of what the nexus is, but if we do the work and we treat it as a cultural value, and then we allow people to get exposure, leadership experience, and also be held accountable from a performance standpoint, then hopefully you can get around kind of some of those feelings of, hey, I'm doing this work and I'm not getting credit for it.
Yeah. Thank you, Wes.
And I think it goes beyond just men, but men in particular, I think it would be great to see more involvement across all aspects of the DEI universe because the stat, I mean, women are 2 times more likely. From what I've seen in interactions I've had, I'm honestly surprised it's not even a little higher, right? So I think as men, we need to do more. We need to challenge each other to get more involved. And I do think the more that can be integrated into performance management and taken seriously. So I know there's companies that have it, what you do, how you do it, and check the box. Yes, I care about this, but I think it needs to evolve and has been evolving, at least at Axis, I know, into a tangible goal that all leaders have on diversity, equity, and inclusion and other leadership behaviors. And it's nice for people to care about it and do the right thing, but what exactly did you do this year to advance it? Just like any other business goal that you're talking through what you tangibly did to help advance the organization. I think the more we can move in that direction, we'll start making real progress on this.
Beautiful. Dan, Ari, Wes, awesome. Thank you so much. And with our college students, I would say they give me this finger snapping as to all the great job you have done. I now want to create this talking room for our global diving community to join us. If you have a question, please raise your hand using the reaction button on your screen or placing it in the chat. Our moderators will call on you. Jan's all yours.
Hi, everyone. So if you have any questions, let us know. If not, we have a couple of extra ones that we can ask of our panelists, but just wanted to check.
All right, as a popping in, I got another question here. Have you ever seen a positive shift or progress in men's perspectives when it comes to gender equity? Do you have an example you can share? I'll repeat it. Have you seen a positive shift or progress in men's perspectives when it comes to gender equity? Do you have an example you can share?
I mean, I have, as I was just challenging that I think men, we need to get more involved. I have seen more involvement if you look at Dive In, hopefully the numbers support this, but engagement in these topics over the last few years. So I do think we're making progress. And I do think something as simple as joining an employee resource group, if your company offers those, whether it's sponsoring or just being a member, I think there's more involvement happening there, and it's becoming more and more of a topic, which I think is a tangible sign of progress.
Beautiful. Well, sorry.
I think the thing that I would add is what I've seen is more willingness to engage in authentic, real conversations around this sort of topic. I think that kind of we were talking about earlier about, how you get yourself intellectually aligned with the concept of allyship. And part of it is getting yourself educated, right? Understanding what it means, but then understanding what barriers have been placed in place that have kind of led us to this moment. And I think to me, that to me is the shift. That's a tangible example of us actually standing up and being honest about kind of what the state of the state is, what it has been, and why it is that it is this way. So I think that there's been a much more kind of activation in the idea of having these kind of hard, courageous conversations about these sorts of topics in a real way, as opposed to just a performative way.
Beautiful.
So team, I have a question for you. So Wes, Michael Mitchell really liked your comment around zero-sum game. So the question is, could you or any of our panelists elaborate a little bit on what you mean by zero-sum game? And also maybe how that metaphor or messaging applies to the insurance industry and also hiring practices. So I'll turn that over to you.
Well, I think really what I meant by it is this idea is, just because you don't give up anything by being an advocate for somebody else. you don't give up anything by allowing other people in the room, right? You don't lose power as a result of sharing power with others and becoming more inclusive and more diverse. So that's really what I mean, right? I think that sometimes there is this perception from some that if I lean into this diversity thing, or if I advocate for somebody else, then where does that leave me, right? And I think that, I don't believe history, it shows that it is a have and have not, and one person must succeed so another person may fail. I think that there's much more power in collaboration and in real diverse collaboration, right? Really inclusive and belonging collaboration across the board. So that's really what I was talking about. It's like you don't lose anything by advocating for others.
I would go even one step further.
Okay.
And look, I'm lucky enough that I got to meet all of you in advance, because we haven't met in the industry before. Jhan, obviously I work with you, but Dan, Rod, Wes, and when we got to meet before and we started talking about even this as a topic, it's like, yeah, I mean, the true catapult forward with this is it doesn't just not take away from you by sharing that spotlight. It's the opposite. Is one of the greatest leadership traits,
Right.
is when you could show some level of humility and make space for others. It doesn't take away from you. It's beyond that. It actually does even more for you. Now, again, advocacy, it's, you need a little courage. You got to be prepared to fail. It's not like you could do it inauthentically and just for the sake of, well, if I do this, it'll make me a better leader. No, that's not what I'm saying. But the skill and of challenging yourself to make space for others, it only makes you a better leader in the long run.
Next question, Jhan. You're on mute. Jhan, we can't hear you.
I'm just talking away. So thanks. We have a great question from Dustin Harvey. Dustin has this for all of you, actually. In your own journeys, professionally, both as allies and advocates, have any of you come across situations where you felt uncomfortable speaking up in particular situations due to fear of being viewed as a troublemaker, or as a result of just speaking up in the past? And Dustin, we thank you for that question. Toss that to the panel.
I would say yes. The short answer is yes. But what I would caveat over there is there's perceived fear and then there's actual fear. There were times, certainly at the beginning of a journey of converting, intellectual allyship to behavioral allyship. At the beginning of that journey for me, I was worried about how people would react. And there were times that I didn't act because of that. But after the fact, in conversations, and then after I started building up the courage to just do it anyway, and then seeing the responses thereafter, I realized some of that fear was perceived, not real. It wasn't an actual threat. It wasn't an actual concern. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but it's important to think about those two aspects a little differently. What if you're about to do something which you think might cause some level of self-harm versus it will cause a level of self-harm? And I think a lot of items fall a bit more into that perceived side. I've seen a huge amount of support across the executive and leadership and C-suite across not just Everest, across many companies. There's more people there who are willing to hear and understand and are willing to act on that than you think.
Yep. And I think if there wasn't a bit of that fear of the unknown, if it was easy to speak up, everyone would be doing it and there wouldn't be the value, right? So I do think if you have that feeling in your gut, a little bit of unease, that's probably actually a good thing. And I would take it seriously and reflect on those are probably the moments where speaking up will matter even more.
Yeah. Dan, you took the words out of my mouth. I think one of the most difficult things to do as an ally is to really lean into see something, say something, right? I think about the times where I've been in rooms with a bunch of guys and it's just the guys, and somebody said something that intellectually that's off, right? That's not how we should be talking. That's not what we should be doing. That's not how we should be, describing a situation or a person or whatever. So yeah, I absolutely have been those. It's been a battle, I think, for me, right? Sometimes getting it right, sometimes not getting it right, if I'm just being honest. But I've tried to become much more, you know, ready to take the next step. Is, hey, you know what, man, we're not doing that anymore. We're not saying that anymore, right? Like that's not appropriate because we're all subject to things that people say in rooms that we're not in, right? And if you don't have people in those rooms who are going to stand up for you when you're not there, it can be very difficult to achieve, feel comfortable, feel inclusion, feel belonging, get what you want, all those different things. So, I don't sit in front of this group to say that I'm perfect in that regard, but that's where I'm trying to get better. See something, say something in the room where the person, where people, the affected parties, they're not even there to defend themselves. You got to be that person. I want to try and be that person more often than.
Hey, Wes, a quick question here is, are millennials and Gen Z men better at this?
So it's a little out of school for me, right? We definitely have people within Travelers and you do that sort of research and pull together that generational stuff. I think what I have seen, Rod, the answer is yes, that they're better at this type of stuff, and not just in the gender space, but in the ED&I space in general. They tend to be a little better, but I think that we're still in a society where Gen X or Gen Z or baby boomers, right? Like we're all, different, right? And at the end of the day, I think that unfortunately, there still just are people who don't see the need for this sort of work. I think it's getting better, but, I can only hope.
Mm-hmm. So in our last, about 6 minutes left, and we want to make sure we do a closing wrap up. Great question from Sonia Barge. What is the best way that you can detect someone or recognize actually someone being an ally? What are some of the signals that we can kind of pick up and notice? And thank you, Sonia, for this question.
Oh, it's the Jeopardy question.
I know.
It's the
Best
Jeopardy
way to
one.
spot an ally.
Well, firstly, I work with Sonia, so hi. Thanks for coming. And I think it's hard to know intellectually or not. Behaviorally, they're there. It's not a pin, it's not a ribbon, it's not a, it's really, you judge it by the behaviors which are there. And that's where I try. I think, I don't know if everyone else would agree with this one. It's hard for me to self-identify and say, I am an ally. I have decided that I am. I hit this magic threshold where now I've, finished my series 7 of my 8 exams, and now I'm officially an ally. It's not like that. I don't know that I'm enough of an ally or too much of an ally, but ultimately it's the behaviors that matter, and each incremental step is what makes that impact. I think the best way to see it is to see what they're doing, how they're doing it, and whether that's interview practices, hiring practices, promotion practices, conversations, responses. Do they spend up, Wes, to your point, did they make the comment in the room when no one else was saying it? And frankly, the person of topic wasn't in the room. You look at those behaviors and you see it. You can't go in knowing the deep recesses of where someone stands intellectually. It has to ultimately come out in action.
Yeah, and having, like you said, having a badge, saying you're an ally doesn't necessarily mean you actually are. So I do think seeing that, track record of behaviors, we've talked earlier, the consistency in behaviors, and I'm not sure where the question was going, but I think if you're not sure that someone support the cause that I care about, I think rather than just asking, hey, are you an ally or not? You can just approach it as a topic. Are you familiar with allyship and what it means, right? And just kind of start there to break the ice and get a sense. And it's not accusing someone you are or you aren't, right? Because many of us, even that I think like to think of ourselves as allies, might even pause if you just came up and asked us the question bluntly like that, because it's up to the group you're supporting, not the ally individual.
Great point.
Thank you. So we're almost at the end of our time. We want to, on behalf of the global sponsors of this session, my colleagues at Everest, Access Capital, and Travelers, we really want to thank you for joining us On behalf also of the Gender Equity and Gender Parity Workstream for Dive In USA, we are also glad you're here. We want to thank Rod Colon, who is our phenomenal moderator, Wes Alexander from Travelers, Ari Moskowitz from Everest, and Dan from Access Capital. And all of you, enjoy the rest of Dive In 2023, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.
You can do it.
Thanks.